All right, I suppose I'll just go ahead and get started then. My name is Matthew Golden. I'm a now fifth-year PhD student in the School of Physics, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about a project that's been going on for a little while. This project is about using physically constrained machine learning to model complicated active 2D flow. This was done here at Georgia Tech, and I'd like to thank the people I've worked with. Roman Grigoriev is my advisor. And Alberto and Gio Trishnaj, they were my experimental collaborators. And I'd also like to acknowledge Daiwei Sun, who is a recent undergraduate who helped debug a lot of this code. And I'm thankful for all of their time going into this project. So there's a changing paradigm in modeling physical systems. Traditionally, one would make an observation that warrants some sort of description. And they would use either first principles or phenomenology to come up with some mathematical model to describe what you're seeing. Upon making that mathematical model, you would then make new predictions that could be tested. You would go do the experiment to validate those predictions. If they match your model, great. If they don't, you need to fine tune your model, maybe add different terms, see if something is missing, and continue doing this until you understand everything to your sufficient satisfaction. But as there's been an explosion of experimental data available at our fingertips, there's been a collective push to go directly from observations and physical constraints to models. See if we can skip this iterative process altogether and just go directly from the data to mathematical equations that describe it. So in other words, is there a way of taking data like spatiotemporal fields, things like magnetic fields and electrostatic fields, and put them through some black box and obtain Maxwell's equations? Hopefully you're more or less familiar with Maxwell's equations in some capacity. If not, that's all right. The point is that these relate derivatives of the electric and magnetic field in certain ways and tell us how to predict the future with them. They tell us constraints. There's some really nice features. And one thing I'd like to point out is that this black box must have some certain properties in order for this approach to work. The first thing is that it's not a single equation. We're not after a single statement which describes things. There are 4 equations here. And so any black box we construct must be able to find all of these equations and explain all of them to us. It also must respect the symmetry of the system. So we can note that these are scalar and vector equations, 2 scalar equations, 2 vector equations, and this should somehow be built into our model discovery process. So in a little bit more detail, if we look at the mathematical structure of these equations, we have 2 vector equations, and both of them not only are vectors, they also have time derivatives in them. These are dynamical equations. They allow us to predict the future given some initial values of the electric and magnetic fields. We can integrate this into the future. But separately, we have these scalar equations, which are independent knowledge. They do not follow from these vector equations. And they don't say anything necessarily about the future other than if they're satisfied initially, these evolution equations will preserve them and they will continue to be true as you go into the future. And so we might ask, what can we even assume about the equations that describe our data? Can we assume the presence of time derivatives in equations? Are we actually looking for dynamical PDEs? Or are we looking for constraints that tell us things about our data independent of how they're evolving? And in general, beyond scalars and vectors, what kinds of equations are even possible? Is this it? Should we just be looking for things which are invariant with respect to symmetries, which transform sort of the most trivial way? What can we actually build? And to this end, I would like to go over a simple and familiar example, hopefully. So if you've taken Physics 1, I'm sure you've looked at blocks on inclined planes. So here we have a simple example. A block is sitting on the plane. It feels a force of gravity straight down, and there's a normal force that cancels out its direction into the block that points up at an angle. It's linearly independent. This is a linear relationship, but at the same time, it cannot be described by a simple scaling. The vector n is not just a scalar multiple of f. There's something more complicated going on. And if you're familiar with matrices, this is a matrix operation. There is this matrix sigma that must take the force of gravity and turn it into the normal force that comes out of it. And so this is a simple example, but it gets to the point that there are more complicated objects that exist by necessity to explain linear and multilinear relationships between observables. So to get a bit more into the rank 2 tensors, they're linear maps from vectors to vectors. You could think about them like matrices, but they aren't necessarily like matrices. For the purposes of this talk, you can think about them like matrices. But you can see it's a function of theta. This matrix has 4 components, and each one is some trigonometric function of 2 times the angle. And it acts on the force of gravity by a linear relationship here, this matrix multiplication, to produce the components of the normal force. And we can write this in an index notation, Ni equals sigma ij fj. And what I mean by this last notation here critically is the exact equation written above, where I can take values 1 and 2, j can take values 1 and 2. But any time that there is a repeated index, there's an implied summation. This is the Einstein summation notation, and we use it because we're lazy and it's effective. So it works at creating all sorts of these vectors and other relationships. And while this might seem fairly trivial, there are higher rank tensors that happen all the time in physics. So for instance, we say a rank of a tensor is the number of indices attached to it. So we just looked at vectors and tensors, where vectors had 1 index and tensors, or the matrix had 2 indices. But so it's an example of a rank 0 object might be the pressure of some hydrodynamic system. You could have a velocity field dictating where things are flowing. That would be a vector. There are stress tensors that appear in fluid dynamics. If you're doing anything on a curved surface, or you might encounter the metric field is another rank 2 tensor. Rank 3, the one that immediately jumped to my head, was the Levi-Civita symbol, which defines the cross product in 3 dimensions that we all know and love. So this is a totally anti-symmetric tensor. And if you want to study curvature on a curved surface, the natural object to do that with is the Riemann tensor, which is rank 4. And I couldn't really think of a good rank 5, so I stopped the list here. But the point is these objects exist, and we can write equations with them beyond just the standard vector equations. And the really important aspect of tensors is how they transform under coordinate transformations. For the purposes of this talk, we're just going to be considering Euclidean space with Cartesian coordinates. If you know what contravariant and covariant indices are, this conversation straightforwardly extends to that. But for now, we're just going to treat all indices the same and assume that the transformations that are happening are rotations. So given a rotation matrix, RIP, we can either write it in the left in index form, where the new tensor has components I, and we're doing a sum with the second index P to act on the old vector. Or we can write it in the traditional, you've probably seen this boldface notation for matrix operations. And this extends to rank 2 tensors as well. So if you have a rank 2 tensor, now each index of the old tensor must sum with a new index of a rotation matrix. And you're lucky enough that you're able to actually move one of those to the other side, take a transpose. And so if you wanted to write this in the traditional matrix notation, you'd find that it's a similarity transformation. You have a rotation on one side and inverse rotation on the other, because the transpose of rotation is its inverse. And this does things like preserves the trace and the eigenvalues and things that we're sort of used to thinking about. But when we go to these higher rank tensors, like suppose we have a rank 3 object tau, there is no useful matrix representation. And so we have to free ourselves from the shackles of thinking about things as matrices and vectors. These are far more general and can do more powerful things and transform in ways that are consistent with the symmetries that we're interested in. Also, this is not the only way to represent tensors. You don't necessarily need to use the index notation. I would like to mention a graphical notation, which can be done in the style of Penrose, or you can see birdtracks.eu for a more pictorial description. So once you have these objects, the things you can do to create more of them, you can add them and linearly scale them if you'd like, but you can also do things like the tensor product. So given 2 vectors, you can take an exterior product of them to get a rank 2 object that now transforms like a matrix. If you have any kind of other, so this isn't restricted to just vectors. If you have a rank 2 and a rank 3 object, you can put them next to each other, you get a rank 5. The rank just adds linearly. You can just keep adding more and more indices as you see fit. Also, once you have a tensor, you can rearrange its indices in any way that you'd like. The actual order of them doesn't matter explicitly. And this allows us to do things like symmetrization. So if you have a rank 3 object, tau ijk, in principle, you could cycle all the indices as I've done here and obtain a new tensor, assuming this is a general one. And then lastly, the most interesting one, I think, is contractions, where you choose 2 of these indices and you sum over them. So I went from a rank 3, tau ijk, and I picked 2 and I summed them. I took a trace over those 2 dimensions. And this takes tensors, reduces the rank by 2, gives you a new tensor. Well, what I think is interesting about this is that for a rank 2 tensor, there's a unique trace operation. You have 2 indices that uniquely takes you to a single scalar. For a rank 3 object like this, it's not unique. I've chosen here to sum over the second and third index, but I could just as well have summed over any of the other pairs and obtain distinct different vectors from this original rank 3 tensor. And so these vectors that you get out of this tensorial algebra tell you non-trivial things about the original data structures or original tensors that you were looking at. So revisiting the block, we can, now that we have this notion of tensors and operations we can do to them, there's a lot more physics we can pull out than our original equation. We can look at the trace of sigma ij, sigma ii, and we see that it's -1. It's independent of the angle theta. It has no dependence on the actual geometry of the ramp, which tells us something about the isotropy of space and the fact that there aren't necessarily preferred directions. We can look at the force balance equation, n being equal to sigma times f. This is the rank 1 relation that we initially started with that motivated the definition of sigma. And this is related to momentum conservation. And lastly, sigma ij is a symmetric matrix, which you can see that none of these relations imply each other. These are all independent pieces of knowledge that describe the problem. Sigma ij being symmetric, the rank 2 relation, tells us something about angular momentum conservation and how the block won't just spontaneously roll necessarily down the ramp. And so when we're thinking about going from data to equations that describe it, I think it's important to understand that there's a wide space of equations that could possibly be obtained to describe this physics. So I guess I'll pause here for a second. Are there any questions? Not, I will continue. Okay, so another word on rank 2 tensors. Supposing I have any equation, sigma ij equals 0, because I have rotational symmetry, it immediately splits into 3 independent equations. So I could take the trace of this, and because sigma ij equals 0, I naturally get the trace of that equals 0. That's that top equation. I can subtract off the same thing, but with j and I flipped, and this produces the anti-symmetric relation. Or I could add the symmetrized copy and then subtract off the overall trace. So this is assuming we're in 2 dimensions, and delta ij is the identity or Kronecker delta. And all of these equations clearly follow from the first one, but they're independent. We are allowed to, given the first one, immediately assume all 3. And this is an irreducible representation of this group. So from these rank 2, which transform in a certain way into rotation, all 3 of these equations transform independently. For instance, the trace doesn't transform at all. It's a scalar. It doesn't experience any rotation in any meaningful way. The other 2 do experience rotation, but in different ways. They're not necessarily immediately. I think they're isomorphic for 2-dimensional rotations, but for higher dimensional rotations, they're certainly not. So I think when we go out and look for models, it's important to, instead of looking just for rank 2 equations, we can make a direct split into looking for traces of rank 2 equations, anti-symmetric rank 2 equations, and symmetric trace-free rank 2 equations. So going back to the example of the cat and the bar magnet, really maybe a better way of thinking about it is we have data of an electromagnetic field, and we're instead looking to fill these baskets, these boxes of possible models, model spaces that models could exist in. What's interesting is that for this talk, we will consider rank 0, rank 1, and then the 2 non-trivial rank 2 spaces. The rank 2 trace is actually a subset of the rank 0 space. It's just more scalars. And so if we were to systematically go through here and look for physical law, by the time we get to the rank 2 trace, we would have already found anything that's in it. It would have been in the rank 0 library. So there's no point in continuing to look in that space. So we have 4 possible spaces to find equations which describe our system. So this brings us to sort of the thesis of this talk, which is a physics-inspired way of deriving equations from data called SPIDER. So sparse physics-inspired discovery of empirical relations. This is a framework for taking experimental data, which is spatially extended and temporally varying, and obtaining qualitatively simple but quantitatively accurate models that describe that data. So I'm going to walk you through it, but the overarching structure is just that you gather your data and the possible things that make sense to even evaluate given your symmetry group. You look at the irreducible representations there, which are, again, different tensor spaces that physical law can exist in. You create a library out of all of your data that you create terms that transform the same and can fit in each of those irreducible spaces. You evaluate it using your data in a clever fashion. And then lastly, you do sparse regression to actually obtain simple equations that correspond to each library. So we'll break it down piece by piece to get a better picture. And we'll also talk about the experiment this is actually applied to. I haven't said anything about active pneumatics up until this point. So active pneumatics is a very interesting emerging field where for our particular experiment, we use microtubule clusters. So these are, they make up the cytoskeleton of your cell, provide structure inside of a lot of biological systems. And normally on the right here, you can see that there are these kinesin motor proteins that walk along and transport things throughout your cell. These have these 2 feet that alternate. It consumes ATP in order to walk along the microtubule. And what this experiment has done is it used motor proteins with feet on both ends. So it latches onto both sides of the microtubules and walks along them if they're oriented in the opposite direction. Otherwise, it does cross-linking and it provides a structure to it. So these microtubules consume ATP in the environment. They're trapped in a 2-dimensional suspension between water and oil, and it provides energy for a self-driving flow. Energy is added through the ATP, and it's dissipated through viscosity. So here's a video of that experiment, which I think is very pretty. So this is exactly what I said. Each side, I want to say, is about 0.5 millimeter to give you some physical scale. And this is playing 30 times faster than it's observed in real time. So it's a very slow flow, but it's sped up here so we can get a sense of what's going on. And we're interested in finding differential equations which describe the continuum limit of this flow. There's a lot of things happening in these black regions, which are devoid of any microtubules, where there's topological constraints that enter. But we're interested in between them, where the microtubules are dense and you can actually get a sense of where they're oriented. Can we find macroscopic equations which actually describe the dominant physics?
So all of the white lines are the tubules.
Yes, yeah, the white lines are the tubules. And I couldn't tell you the typical lifetime of these experiments, but it's significantly longer than the time we're recording them. I'll say that. So the ATP concentration is effectively constant in time as these are moving forward. Okay, so now it's time to talk about the data we can extract from this directly. So one of the basic objects is the director field, which is a vector field which points parallel everywhere to these fibers. So you can see on the right is a zoomed in snapshot of the experiment. On the left is this vector field. The simplistic way to calculate it is just to take an image gradient and rotate it 90 degrees, but that's very susceptible to noise. So essentially these vectors just point along lines of minimal gradient in the image, but the image is very noisy, so that there's some clever smoothing that needs to go on behind the scenes. Anyhow, the black regions are topological defects, which I've denoted with red here. And my main point for this slide is that there's this line, I don't know if you can see it, in between the defects right here, where the arrows spontaneously flip sign. So they go from pointed up to pointed downwards. And otherwise, this vector field is smooth everywhere. And what this tells us from these topological defects in the presence of this branch cut going through is that this isn't an ordinary vector field like you might be used to. This is a pneumatic vector field. So it has pneumatic symmetry, meaning the vector field is congruent to its additive inverse. It's the same as pointed the opposite direction. The only physically meaningful quantity that we get out of this vector is the axis it points along, not its magnitude or the sign of its direction. And so if I plot both the positive and negative vector field, you can see that it's smooth everywhere except at the red points there. And this immediately adds a complication because it isn't clear what a differential equation means for a field like this. What does it mean to take a spatial derivative of something like this if there's a branch cut nearby? Locally, you can always define a region where n is consistently oriented, but globally, if there's topological defects, you're more or less guaranteed to have these regions where there's apparent discontinuities in the pneumatic field. And for this reason, a lot of people in the literature have chosen to use a symmetric trace-free tensor. So this is rank 2, it's quadratic in the director field. And it doesn't suffer these branch cuts. Because it's quadratic, changing the sign of n has no impact on q. It's invariant with respect to this transformation. And n can be obtained back again as the axis of n is one of the eigenvectors of this rank 2 tensor. So the information is still all there. It's globally continuous. Here's the image of Q11, which is one of the independent components of it. And you can even, I think it's even easier to pick out topological defects when you're looking at Q11. You can see that they're sort of where the intense blue meets the intense red. That's the locations of the topological defects. And this brings up an interesting point, which is it's not even clear a priori how you should represent your data in tensor structure. Going from n to q is going from a vector to a rank 2 tensor. And q is globally certainly a better choice. And the literature has used it more or less from first principles, but it's something to think about, and something that the scientists should do is figure out how to represent your data such that it transforms well with respect to the symmetries of the system. The other data we can get is the velocity field. So on the left, I have the flow velocity plotted as a vector with the dots again pinning down the topological defects at the very first frame. And on the right, I have a GIF of about 10 frames of the experiment showing the overall drift of those topological defects. So for the very first frame, more or less everything is drifting upwards to the left. And this is measured with particle image velocimetry, PIV. There are many open source packages to do it, although this was, I believe, done with DABIZ by Chris Crawley. And this gives us access to, so now we have a second vector field that we can do things with. And again, we can think about irreducible representations, but there's nothing that really can be done to U immediately. As a vector, it's safe. We can't split it any further. And then I'll also mention, you can ask a question.
Yeah, so in this case, you can basically interpolate over the defects and get rid of them, right? Or at least the picture makes it look like you could draw another arrow in there and not worry about the defects at all.
You're saying
for the velocity.
For the flow velocity, yeah, the flow velocity doesn't suffer the same topological problems. The flow has a much larger scale than the pneumatic field, and so it typically doesn't suffer any sort of problem there. But because we can't resolve the pneumatic field there, we end up discarding that data for training. That's a good question.
Just wanted to ask something to clarify. So
sure.
When we go from the director field to that rank 2 tensor, so when we are using a symmetric part, are we throwing away some kind of anti-symmetric part? Or
so this is a great question. So for some things maybe, but for this particular tensor, no, because the quadratic product is this one right here, the Ni and J, and that's a symmetric product because it's the same vector on both sides. But if you were doing a tensor product of two different vector fields, certainly there'd be an anti-symmetric, and even the trace, which is just the dot product of the two vectors.
In those cases, there would be loss of information if we go from your director view to this new coordinate or whatever.
Maybe loss of information isn't the best way to put it. I would say there's a splitting of independent information. There's a splitting of information that resides in the rank 2 symmetric from the rank 2 anti-symmetric. So
it becomes like a multi-channel thing.
Yeah, it's a splitting of that information into all of its independently transforming components. Right. Good question, thanks. Okay, and we can also talk about differential operators. This is a fundamentally three-dimensional flow, but we're searching for a two-dimensional PDE. We are imaging a two-dimensional slice and hoping we can reduce the degrees of freedom of this to just find a purely two-dimensional model that doesn't explicitly take into account the third dimension. And so the two operators we have at hand are the spatial gradient, nabla I, and the partial derivative with respect to time.
You have a real quick question.
Yeah,
In terms of the director field, I might have missed it. What's the like physical interpretation of that? Is that just the the direction of the tubules?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So I guess I should have put the experimental picture here, but you can see that the left defect is sort of triangular and the right one is a loop. And if you look here, you'll see the triangular structure in the loop on the right. Okay. Yeah, it aligns with the microtubules at each point. Exactly. So these two differential operators interplay with our tensor structure. So the partial derivative with respect to time doesn't change the tensorial rank of any object. It has no indices associated with it. But the spatial derivative does. The spatial derivative adds a rank to everything. If you have a vector field, taking the spatial gradient gives you a rank 2 tensor. You can take a second gradient to get a rank 3, and so on and so on. And then you can construct things like vectors and other terms by contracting back down. So I don't have a slide on this, but intuitively, the way you might go about building interesting tensors is by building something with many, many free indices, and then just taking all possible contractions and seeing what you can end up with. That will enter into it. So now that we've talked about data and the differential operators and what kind of derivatives we can take, I think it's important to revisit the symmetries of this because it's a little bit different than the block example we talked about before, although many of the same themes still carry over. We have rotational symmetry and nematic symmetry, as well as translational symmetry in space and time. And all of these have profound effects on the models that could possibly describe our data. Rotation tells us that we should end up with traceless symmetrized tensors, as we described previously. So for the rank 2 case, we've gone through that. For higher rank tensors, there's something called the Young tableau that you can apply, but that's not of direct use here. The nematic symmetry is the changing of the sign of n. And this tells us that no equation can contain simultaneously even powers of n and odd powers of n. Because if it did, changing the sign would change some terms, but not others. They must all coexist in the same kind of structure. So I'm going to call things that have even powers of n nematic invariant because they don't change, and things that change sign nematic covariant because they change exactly like n does. So a general empirical relation is going to be a sum over R, where R is no longer an index. R isn't an index, even though it might look like it. It's a label over different nonlinear tensors you could possibly construct. So we're summing over those nonlinear tensors, where C are the coefficients. And the translational invariance tells us that these coefficients should be constant. They shouldn't be functions of space and time. They should just be a single number that we can derive from the data. So this right-hand side, these traceless symmetrized tensors that are exclusively even and odd powers of n, these are going to really make up what we do. We're going to search for these tensors and try to find algebraic closure, linear dependencies in them that describe physics. And for this project, we're going to be considering 4 of the rotational irreducible parts, and then the 2 possible cases of the nematic field. We're not going to consider nematic covariant rank 2 objects. The only rank 2 objects will be even powers of n, just like Q. You can think of Q since it's even powers of n. It'll transform like that. So these are 6 libraries, and all of them in principle contain independent laws. It would be interesting to see what's in them. So that's the story that we'll look at today. This is something I'd like to spend some time on. So this is the actual idea of constructing libraries. So now that we've talked quite a bit about what things actually can exist, we'll put pen to paper and work things out. So again, an empirical physical relation is this sum of CR FR equals 0. And we want to figure out what FRs should be allowable in a specific similarly transforming group. So these are collections of equivalently transforming objects, same irreducible representation. And unfortunately, the libraries are formally infinite. If you're thinking about like the divergence of the flow field as a scalar that doesn't care about the sign of n, you could have any power of that in your library. You could have first power, second, third. And at some point, it's the role of the scientist to decide on a truncation rule, when to actually terminate these series and decide your basis is complete enough to find anything that you want to find. So in our case, we use 3 physical considerations to determine when the cutoff would be appropriate. The first consideration is that this is a slow velocity. This is a low Reynolds number flow. This isn't, even though it's called active turbulence, it does not have the same scaling as traditional turbulence. These are non-inertial effects that are causing the chaos. And so we only keep terms linear and U. Anything higher than that, quadratic or more, we will assume falls off fairly rapidly because of the slow flow velocity. So there's no need to include it in the library. I'll say for some of the libraries, I actually included the higher order terms, and I can assure you it doesn't end up mattering. So it really is a safe assumption, at least up to quadratic order. Also, our data is fairly smooth. The length scale over which our flow varies and nematic field varies. As far as our data goes, the length scales are rather large. We have something like 20 grid points for a characteristic change in things. And so I'm going to assume that higher derivatives don't add significant new information. Taking a 4th order derivative is going to look very similar to a 2nd order derivative. for a lot of these fields. And so we're going to constrain ourselves only up to only include terms with up to second order derivatives. And lastly, the director field, I didn't say this before, but the norm of the director field is 1. It's a unit vector. The magnitude has no physical meaning. We only care about the direction it points in. Because it has no associated magnitude, or rather the associated magnitude is unity, it can appear any number of times. There is no physical constraint for how many times n can appear, which is arguably a physical constraint. So that's why it's included in this list. And so with these 3 rules, you can systematically construct every possible term that could appear in a library. It's finite, and you can compute it with your favorite programming language, although we did it by hand the first time around, which is quite a bit of work. So something like the scalar pneumatic invariant library. These are simple scalars that you should be very familiar with or can imagine, like unity, something just 1. You can add a constant to any of these models. The divergence of the flow, nabla I ui, the dot product of the gradient and the flow velocity. And then the problem with the gradient of n is that it's odd in n, right? So you have to square it. You are forced to take it to some power, some even power if you want to include it. And you can imagine carrying out this procedure and figuring everything out. Does anyone have a guess as to how many scalar pneumatic invariants there are? Given this prescription, I've only included 3, but how many do you think you can construct?
Go up in finding.
Well, we're applying these truncation rules, these physical considerations to throw out terms that go beyond those. So like we're only going linear in U. We're not talking about the divergence of U squared. 20? All right, I'll take one more guess.
That'd be it. Just 3.
Okay, also just 3. All right, so it's 9 is how many you can construct. If you're curious what they are, you can go check out the paper. But yeah, but and this kind of leads into why we went to this approach in the first place, is because a priori coming up with all things, just guessing and writing things down, you're going to miss them. So things like the elastic energy of a liquid crystal, historically terms were left out at the very first publication because the guy who wrote it down just missed them. He forgot that they could exist. So humans are fallible, but if you come up with a systematic procedure to generate all of these, you can be sure you aren't missing anything. So an example of a higher rank library, this is sort of the worst it gets in our case. So when we spent quite a long time looking for a momentum equation, the analog of the Navier-Stokes equation for our flow, we looked at things. So you can see we have familiar things like just the flow velocity by itself and the time derivative of the flow velocity. But we also have rather ugly ones that involve these quantities B and S, which are related to the derivatives of n. So you get something about 25 vectors you can construct. And then we also included a large library of possible stress tensors that could impact the results. So all in all, it was about 60 terms that could enter into it, which is now non-trivial. Looking for linear dependencies in 60 dimensions that are sparse does take a bit of computational time. But I think that even searching these libraries for physical law takes at most 5 minutes. I'll say that. So not too bad. Any questions about this slide? I know that many of these variables I haven't introduced, but does this approach making sense as to how you generate all these?
Systematically looking at basically all terms.
Yeah, it's
Shotgun method.
Yeah, it really, we're just shotgunning every possible physical relation, basically. That we can get from the data we can measure. Of course, there's things like the density field, right? Where we didn't measure the density. You would assume it's correlated to the intensity field, but getting a rigorous density out of this is tough, and so we've left out those effects. But it turns out not to matter too much in the continuum regime. So now that we have libraries, we have we have 6 different libraries which transform different ways under our symmetry groups. We need to figure out a way to actually back out coefficients from these. And we do this with the weak formulation. The weak formulation is quite nice for PDEs because it attacks noise, which all of our measurements are quite noisy. So the strong form of a PDE model, you assume that a sum of nonlinear terms vanishes everywhere in space, at every point in space and time. Whereas the weak form here, so the strong form, it should be CR F of R, but this was taken from a previous presentation, so C alpha and F of alpha. And Z is whatever variables you have at your disposal. The weak form, instead of looking at individual points, you pick space-time regions. You pick cubes of your available data, and you integrate them with weight functions phi. And what this gives you is actually a sort of matrix of equation, a system of equations, this matrix G, where G is your integrated nonlinear terms. So in one direction in the matrix, you get all of your different nonlinearities that you're considering, and the other direction, you get all of the different space-time cubes that you sampled with your data. And these operate on this coefficient vector C, which describes the physical law of your system. And so you're reducing the problem of finding physical descriptions to finding null vectors of this matrix, or approximate null vectors of this matrix. The weak formulation is especially nice because it can do things like remove dependence on latent variables like pressure. For a lot of hydrodynamical systems, you don't necessarily have access to pressure data. If you do numerics, it's no problem, but if you're doing an experiment and you can't actually measure these things, you can use clever weight functions that simply eliminate its contribution from the equations. And so you can study the rest of the dynamics independent of pressure, and you can even go back and reconstruct the pressure afterwards if you calculate the coefficients. And you can remove derivatives from your noisy data with integration by parts. So if you have something here on the bottom, like a weak form integral of the time derivative of z, as long as your weight function vanishes on the boundary and its derivatives vanish on the boundary, you can transfer that derivative over and analytically take it. So you never have to numerically difference some of these terms. It's not possible in general to remove all derivatives from data, but you can usually take off, one derivative. If you have something that needs third order derivatives, you can probably evaluate it only taking the second derivative explicitly. It's a very powerful technique. And also, these are evaluated numerically with the trapezoidal rule, which has very nice convergence properties. When these weight functions vanish and their derivatives vanish at the boundaries, they converge faster than you would normally expect. So what we do is we take, say you have a library, you're looking at the rank 2 symmetric trace-free things. The field I've introduced that actually has this property is Q. So here's a space-time cube, and I'm evaluating its independent components. It has 2 independent components. I can evaluate them in space, and you can see defects moving around on them. I have some envelope phi, which vanishes on the boundary. This is my weight function I'm integrating with respect to. And when I multiply them together, I get a sort of subsample. It's almost like subsampling, but it smoothly falls off in the distance. And I then compute that numerically and arrive at 2 numbers, which I input into my G matrix. So I went from quite a bit of data. This could be hundreds to thousands of elements of my data, and I've crushed them down into just 2 that I'm putting into my feature matrix G. And then I would pick a new spatiotemporal domain, and I would do that again. I'd find 2 more numbers by integrating these independent components, and I'd do it 1 more time. And this is how I would populate the columns. I would pick a nonlinear term, evaluate it, integrate it, and make this feature matrix. Does anyone have questions about the construction of this?
Systematically then?
Yeah, I'm not handling how integration by parts is done, but yeah, with integration by parts, it gets a little more complicated because then you can explicitly compute the derivatives of your weight function and do other things. But yeah, it's done.
I'm not exactly clear about the definition of this G matrix. Like, what are the rows and what are the columns?
Right. So I probably could have done a better job here. So this whole column corresponds to the Q tensor. It corresponds to 1 nonlinear object in your library. And then as you move down it, these are the evaluations of the independent components on different subsamplings of your data, on different cubes. And then so each time you hop to a different gray column here, that's a different nonlinearity. It could be the symmetric trace-free gradient of your flow. It could be, I don't know, there's many different crazy ones that you can construct. But the point is that this process is sort of robust to whatever tensor rank you're considering. For a scalar field, you would just get a single number at each space-time cube. For vectors, you get 2. For these kind of tensors, you get 2. You can imagine how it would scale for different kinds of objects. And again, so physical relations are going to exist as vectors C for which GC equals 0 or nearly 0. So that's the search that we're going to be doing. So lastly, we have our coefficient equation, and now it's time for sparse regression. We have to actually find the linear dependencies, the solutions to these, and understand the physics that they tell us. So you start out with G, where each column here, I have them labeled as the Fs, those terms in your libraries. And if you want to minimize G of C equals 0, does anyone know that the analytic solution to if you want to minimize an overdetermined system?
It goes for any regression system, it goes like x transpose x multiplied by. Like,
Right.
Yeah,
right.
there's a closed form.
Yeah, there's closed form. You can get it very quickly with the singular value decomposition, right? So the singular vector corresponding to the smallest singular value will give you the closest null vector or approximation to a null vector. Once you have that, in general, you will get something that is dense. You'll get something that has contributions from every single library term. But you can look at how much each library term actually contributes to the norm. And you'll find a lot of terms don't matter. A lot of them have very tiny contributions, and so you simply remove them from the library altogether. So you might find that after you solve for this coefficient vector, F4 isn't needed, really. And so you temporarily, you kick it out of your matrix. So you remove insignificant terms and you try again. You do another singular value decomposition. You look for insignificant terms, you do another singular value decomposition, and so on. And then once you find that removing any more terms significantly increases your error, you can try adding terms back in. See if you accidentally threw something out that was needed before. And this is an iterative process where you mix and match different things until you find kind of a local minimum where any changes to that model do not benefit you in any way. This is actually the best model to hold. And so I'll declare this converged. So if converged, you have a sparse model. It has some subset of the original library and coefficients that describe the interplay of your data. But as we talked about before with Maxwell's equations, more than one relation can exist in the same space. We had the divergence of E equals rho, divergence of B equals 0. These are two scalar laws. We had two vector laws. And so it's not enough to declare victory after you find a single model. You now have to look, and usually this is a dominant balance problem. There's one or two terms that are significantly larger than the rest. And so you take the dominant term and you throw it out of the library altogether, and you start again. So when you do this, you remove the possibility of finding the law that you just found, and you can keep iteratively applying this process to keep finding more and more equations inside the same library, halting when there's nothing left to converge to. So you'll find at a certain point that there is nothing approximately null-like. And a good way to get an estimate of this, honestly, is just to look at the spectrum of singular values. That will give you some intuition as to how many physical laws can exist inside of your space. Any questions about the sparse regression procedure?
Do you account for anything when you remove the dominant term?
How so? What do you mean by that?
Like, so you're saying you remove the dominant term and then repeat. So
yeah, so you go back to the full library. So this procedure is like taking things out of the library, maybe adding one back every so often. So you start with, a library of 60, get down to something like 4 or 5 terms. You take the largest of those 4 or 5, throw it out, go back to the full one, but missing the dominant term, and then try again.
And you're trying it on the same data.
Yeah, you train it on the same data. Because if it's an independent equation, it shouldn't matter that it's the same data. That's a good question. So I'm sure you're all curious what we found. So we looked in 6 different libraries, and we found 9 partial differential equations that describe our data. And something that I'd like to point out is that in every single library we looked, we found something. So these are boxed up by the different irreducible representations of our symmetry group. So here's two scalar laws that are nematic invariant. Here's a scalar law that's nematic covariant, vector law nematic covariant, vector nematic invariant, rank 2 symmetric, nematic invariant, rank 2 antisymmetric, nematic invariant. And this is kind of amazing. And actually, we find things like, we might have expected that the divergence of U was 0 was a decent model because this is probably an incompressible flow, although that's not clear because this is a 2-dimensional model, whereas the actual flow itself is 3-dimensional. So you can imagine this equation being modified. We found a dynamical equation for n. We didn't assume that we were looking for dynamics. It pulled it directly out of the data for us. We also find the dynamics of Q, the Q tensor. We have that equation as well. These are traditionally called the Leslie-Erickson and the Barris-Edwards equations. And these equations aren't logically independent. In the original case of Maxwell's equations, none of those 4 equations follow from each other. But in this case, these 9 equations actually fall into 3 families, where all of them are essentially logically equivalent to each other. You can at least go from, say, this model to there's a couple that generate all of them, but it's not necessarily a bijection inside each family. But you can find the most straightforward, a minimal set of equations which generate all of the ones that you have found. So in our case, we have an equation talking about the divergence of U. You might be wondering if the divergence of U is 0, why didn't I find equations like divergence of U times n is 0? That's because as soon as we realized the divergence of U was 0, we removed it from the library in any interesting capacity, because I would have had to add a whole other slide full of just those models, and that's not particularly interesting. So otherwise, we have equations relating. A is the symmetric trace-free gradient of the flow, and so we found some coupling between the flow gradient and U, and these are all the same family. So the most compact set of 3 equations that describes what we're seeing are these 3. I've written them in the traditional form. We've dropped index notation because we finished and we're not going to hold you hostage with it anymore. So we have the divergence of U equals 0, the Erickson-Leslie equation relating the gradient or the time derivative of n to gradients in the flow and gradients in n. And then we find this rather unexpected force balance equation here. And what's so interesting is we can actually, we did this not just to find equations, but to learn the physics as to what was actually happening. And we can give it a qualitative explanation for all of these. We can say the first one is mass conservation. The second one, the co-rotation of the director field with the flow, is angular momentum conservation. And this force balance on the bottom relates to linear momentum conservation. And these equations don't necessarily look like how you'd expect them to look. Traditional first principles models have extra terms, and certainly the very last term, or the very last equation, has a completely different form in the literature usually, because people are used to thinking in 3-dimensional flows. And so a priori, I would have never guessed this, but our algorithm finds it and tells it to you. And you might question it, and you can keep taking more data and rerunning it, but if it's physical, you'll keep finding the same thing. So I think of these redundancies as ensuring confidence in these models. The fact that they're found logically between all of these different irreducible representations means there's something actually happening there. This isn't just a fluke from one library. This is actual physics taking place. And then the last thing I'll note, which is quite interesting, is that our data tells us which equations need to be modified. We talked about topological defects for a second, and because we can't extract the density field and the director field isn't particularly accurate near these topological defects, we didn't use them for training. So this is supposed to found a complete mathematical model. The traditional models are 3 equations. We found 3 equations, and this works. You could simulate this in regions without defects. But if you want to be able to handle defects, we need to modify these equations in some way. And our data tells us it's the first and third equation that need modified, because we can evaluate them in those regions and see that there's qualitative discrepancies. And actually, it gives us an intuition as to how we need to change them. So even particularly for this first one, we have a pretty good guess as to what needs to go into it in order to make it work near defects. So other people in the group have successfully applied Spider to highly noisy numerics and experimental systems. So this approach has been used for the CoS equation, lambda omega, thin film turbulence, and turbulent channel flow. And I know for a fact in the turbulent channel flow, the data had 50% noise added to it, and the equations without viscosity were still able to be discovered. In experiment, it's been applied to thin film turbulence and essentially agreed with the theoretical predictions, and also the active pneumatic system, which we've talked about today. And I'll finish about 10 minutes early with this summary. So Spider allows knowledge synthesis directly from the data. The role of the scientist was to enforce physical constraints and physical considerations. And through our analysis of the data, we've found knowledge directly through it. We did not do first principles analysis here. This is just from the symmetry and from the data. And there's many different kinds of scientific knowledge. And the one that this is specifically aimed at is interpretable mathematical models. We're trying to find differential equations that can be solved and used to make quantitative predictions, but are still qualitatively simple enough for us to understand what is actually happening. And physical constraints are essential for making the problem tractable. If we hadn't pointed out rotational symmetry, our scalar library would not have been 9 terms. It would have been hundreds. Or if we didn't assume translational symmetry and that coefficients had to be constant, you would soon turn to neural networks and other things to do the learning for you. But the fact that we have so significantly reduced the data space with physical constraints and symmetries allows us to do things like sparse regression and get nice answers out of it. Also, this approach is systematic modular in general. So if you don't like any particular step that we did there, you think you have a better idea. If you don't like our system of equations that we got from the weak formulation, you can replace that with something else and still use the rest of the string. If you, instead of sparse regression, want to do some sort of neural learning, you can do that as well. These are pieces that could be swapped out to give you better access to the particular system you're interested in. And this is applicable to disciplines outside of physics. If you're looking at chemical systems or biological systems or ecological systems, perhaps, as long as it has space-time data associated with it, and there might be some local PDE description, this could be a tool to help discover that. So I think I will close with that and go into questions.
Any questions from the audience? And if you don't mind switching to the chat just to see if there might be some questions from online audience as well. Any questions?
Yeah, sure. So, you said this works well for kind of any system that has some continuum of data. Alternatively, could you use something similar to look at like network dynamics, where you have a large number of discrete nodes that are, changing in time?
I think it would be hard to come up with some sort of symmetry-based approach for a network, unless you assume that there's some sort of similar structure at every node. I don't know. I'm not sure if networks are directly applicable. If this is directly applicable to networks.
Unless the network has a symmetry.
Right.
Even if it doesn't have symmetry, and if you have really, really long data, you can don't throw away the terms and keep on doing it. If it has enough data, it would converge.
True. Yeah. I mean, with enough data, you could probably converge from a library.
I have seen some people do this trick. So since you were mentioning about neural networks, some people use simulated data to train those, and then experimental data to test those. In principle, people shouldn't merge these two, but nowadays people do that.
Right. Yeah. I've seen that in one case in particular.
Any other questions from the audience? Any questions from anybody online?
Any questions? Oh, sorry.
So does it actually need to be spatio-temporal? Can it only be spatial or only?
Yeah, you could use purely spatial or purely temporal. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's just if you want to find partial differential equations, then ideally there should be more than one. But yeah, the problem with finding ODEs can be carried out in a very similar fashion.
I have a question. Is there a particular reason that you're doing this with separate space and time derivatives instead of using like a 4-vector approach?
So yeah, this is a great question, and something I've been asked about at conferences is, what are we doing about Galilean invariance? So I mean, certainly these velocities are slow and much slower than the speed of light. So we can neglect Lorentz invariance, but Galilean invariance still sort of begs the question. And you can use 4 vectors and things for that. And I think that to assume Galilean invariance for the system is to go a bit too far, because there is a natural rest frame for the system. It is sandwiched between 2 plates, and presumably the oil and water between those 2 plates has 0. There's a rest frame at the experiment. And when we do this dimensional, we do this averaging the 3rd dimension, this dimension reduction from 3 to 2. It is entirely reasonable. And in fact, in this paper on thin film turbulence, you'll actually find that the resultant model breaks Galilean invariance.
Interesting. Okay. I guess it depends on what system you want to apply this to then.
Right. So I guess maybe a more holistic approach would even just be sort of assume as many symmetries as you want, even if they might not be valid. If it works and finds models, great. If it doesn't, slowly back off, allow symmetry breaking of various things, and see when it actually starts working.
All the symmetry does is effectively just limit the size of your library, right?
Right.
So if you add symmetries in, that's similar to adding the terms in from before.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the symmetry does more than limit your library, right? It actually separates different equations between different or small representations.
That's true.
There's 2 aspects of it.
Questions from the audience? Last time? Last call?
Last call for questions online.
This one is more focused on the method rather than the underlying principles behind it, but you know any idea of how it would scale to like higher dimensions of data, like if you wanted to do 3-dimensional or something beyond that for some reason?
Yeah, so I can shout out Carlos here for, he generalized our integration functions to handle arbitrary dimension data. So I don't know what the scaling is, but we already have code to handle whatever dimension you want. I would assume, so the real workhorse here in terms of dimension is computing the weak form integrals. And integrals are very parallelizable, especially if you're doing trapezoidal rules. So if you have a big enough GPU or a big enough cluster, it shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, turbulent channel flow is 3D.
Yeah.
The reason you use the weak form integrals is just for the sake of
Produce noise, yeah,
Okay.
make a noise robust. Yeah, the only reason,
sure, yeah.
the only reason in this paper that you're able to recover from 50% noise out of your data, you can get the equations is because you're doing weak form.
That makes sense.
I think that is the only reason, right? With that much noise.
I think
That's the main reason, right? I mean, also get rid of latent variables.
Right.
I would imagine it probably doesn't take as long as the strong one. Yeah. That's just a side note.
Yeah, like for instance, you can have really bad data. I mean, maybe you can actually comment on sort of, if you have numerical simulations that generate data that's not reliable.
Right. Yeah. So what you can do, there's characteristic if you're integrating a differential equation with too large of a time step, there will be spontaneous instabilities that happen because of that, and they can potentially modify the effective PDE that you're solving. So if you aren't solving Laplace's equation right, or you're stepping too forward in time, you can accumulate linear or nonlinear modifications to the underlying equations, and the weak form is good at actually picking this out.
I mean, I know in this case this is for like quotation stuff, but let's say if you know your physical law, could you use this to learn about the geometry? Like how the geometry is affecting?
Oh, you're saying could you go the other way?
Yes. So I was like, I don't know, if you know how to solve the equation on something flat. Now let's say there's some geometry that might make the equation look a little bit different.
Yeah,
Like,
I
you can
guess.
still integrate by parts. So could you learn something about that geometry?
I think you definitely could. I mean, the way you would generalize this to curvilinear coordinates is making all these Nabla's covariant derivatives. And these are all linear modifications with whatever connections you want. So, I mean, in principle, those connections could be learned. Yeah, if you know the form of the model, you would break translational invariance, certainly. So now the coefficients would no longer be constants. They would be functions that would need to be learned with some basis. But I think it would be possible.
What you care probably at the end is functional dependence, right? How, for instance, your model depends on curvature. So you have to feed it data that corresponds to different curvatures. Then it can learn how that basically parameter affects the model, right? If you only feed it data from one curvature, then it'll just end up with constant coefficients, and you're not going to know what the dependence is. Right, so Matt hasn't talked about sort of what data you need in order for this to work, right? So if you basically feed the spatial and temporally uniform state, you'll learn nothing.
Yeah.
You need data that shows
Right, so you
the
have
change between any of the things you
so
want.
the richer the data is, the better, right?
Yeah.
I'll quote Dimitri on this. So I sent him some code to do Euler debugging a while ago, and he told me it was broken because it kept spitting out Helmholtz equation. And I asked him if his data satisfied Helmholtz equation. He said, "Well, yeah."
Makes no sense.
Yeah. Anything else?
Right. If not, let's thank Matt again for a great talk.
Thank you, everyone who joined virtually.